Welcome to the Invite Health podcast, where our degreed healthcare professionals are excited to offer you the most important health and wellness information you need to make informed choices about your health. You can learn more about the products discussed in each of these episodes and all that Invite Health has to offer at www.invitehealth.com/podcast. First-time customers can use promo code podcast at checkout for an additional 15% off your first purchase. Let's get started.
As of a few years ago, many people would think of vitamin D simply as our bone health vitamin and not really understand all of the other things that vitamin D is doing to maintain our health. And I want to talk about that in some specifics today because I think it's important, being that we are still in the midst of this pandemic, and there's been so many different studies that have come out looking at the analysis of vitamin D levels among asymptomatic as well as critically ill COVID-19 patients. And I do think that there is a strong correlation between vitamin D status and the actual severity of COVID-19 infections. So I want to talk in general, not specifically about COVID-19, but in general, what it is that vitamin D is actually doing in the human body beyond that of just bone health. So I am Amanda Williams, MD, MPH, and we want to talk about all of the ways in which vitamin D is essential for maintaining our health. Obviously, we know when it comes to bone mineralization, we require vitamin D, and this is in conjunction with things such as calcium and phosphorus, for example, in our other minerals within the bone to maintain that bone density. But we know that vitamin D actually exhibits many non-skeletal effects throughout the human body, especially on the immune system, as well as the endocrine system, as well as the cardiovascular system. And we know that if we are taking vitamin D in from our foods just to maintain normal bone development and maintenance of our bones, okay, that's one aspect. But we also have to realize, do we have enough vitamin D coming from our foods? And this is why, as a whole, as a society, most people have either an insufficiency in vitamin D or an actual deficiency in vitamin D. And we know this. We know that it is estimated that over 1 billion people globally are impacted via vitamin D deficiencies. So there are different levels to which we look at the severity of how low your vitamin D level is. Do you fall into that category of being normal, insufficient, or deficient? This is why having your 25-hydroxy vitamin D level tested on an annual basis is really quite critical to your overall health. So let's talk about how it is that vitamin D is actually working beyond that of just bone health. So we know that vitamin D helps to regulate cell differentiation. So what does that mean? The way that your cells are actually dividing. And we know that this is done via binding to the vitamin D receptor found in most cells throughout the body. So that should kind of clue you in that vitamin D is highly unique. Your vitamins don't have receptors throughout the body, but yet vitamin D does, which is why we know vitamin D plays more of a hormonal role in the body as it does an actual role like a typical vitamin. And observational studies have shown this association between low levels of vitamin D and an increased risk for developing things such as colorectal cancer and breast cancers. So we cannot overlook just how significant it is that vitamin D, that impact that has on our overall health. And we know that other observational studies have looked at the association between vitamin D status and the susceptibility or the severity of different illnesses and autoimmune conditions. We know that type 1 diabetes, for example, we have also linked this with type 2 diabetes. We can look at rheumatoid arthritis. We can look at lupus. We can look at MS, multiple sclerosis. We know that there is adequate evidence out there now that directly links this inverse relationship between low levels of circulating vitamin D and the increased risk for the severity of these types of autoimmune conditions. So there's a lot of science out there that we need to finally get to that point where we are not just associating vitamin D as our bone health vitamin, because it is certainly doing so much more than that. There are trials out there that are investigating whether, vitamin D is linked with cognitive decline. So even in the setting of Alzheimer's disease and dementia, as well as other neurodegenerative diseases, when you look at things like Parkinson's disease, we know that there is this inverse relationship, once again, between circulating vitamin D levels and glucose tolerance. So when we look at insulin resistance, for example, in the setting of metabolic syndrome, and understanding that vitamin D is playing a role into that as well. So all of these different things that we certainly know now about vitamin D and how it is technically a hormone rather than a vitamin, which is why we can now see all of the ways in which vitamin D is required to support so many of the activities that occur within the body. So we think about heart health, when we think about brain health and muscle health, all of these are reliant on the regulation of vitamin D and the genes that control that when it comes to the cell differentiation and cell growth and immune function, metabolic control. All of these things are now known to us. And I think that this is an important thing to always walk away with, which is why I kind of default back to what I was originally talking about in the beginning with the link between vitamin D status and the severity of COVID-19 infection. So there was a study that was done and published in the Endocrine Society journal. So it's the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism, where they noticed in Spain that over 80% of 200 COVID-19 patients in one particular hospital in Spain actually had vitamin D deficiency. And they were linking and saying, okay, well, we know that vitamin D is, kind of like this hormone, and it's responsible for all of these different aspects of our health. But how is it that it could be playing a role in terms of the way that the body is fending off a viral attack from something such as COVID-19? And one of the areas that they really started to look at was inflammation. And I think this is an important part to take away from this. Another study that was published in the Scientific Reports Journal looked specifically at those inflammatory markers. And we know one thing about COVID-19 at this point in time, that in terms of the clinical severity of how it presents in people who often do worse with this, it is because of that hyper-reactive inflammatory response that can occur. And they were looking at this correlation between serum vitamin D levels and things like TNF-alpha levels. And once again, recognizing that vitamin D level being markedly low in the severely ill COVID-19 patients, and recognizing that inflammatory response is high in vitamin D deficient patients. So once again, it's just showing that really critical role that vitamin D is actually playing in our health. And so during the winter months in particular, we know that the normal sun exposure and absorption of vitamin D has a tendency to go down for many parts throughout the world, which is why having adequate supplementation of vitamin D during the cold months is really important for our immune defenses. So we don't want to certainly overlook that. This is once again why I always say having your 25-hydroxy vitamin D level tested is really important in terms of how your body can fend off different foreign invaders. And if we have low vitamin D, we know that our immune system is now potentially more susceptible to having this really unwanted, hypersensitive inflammatory reaction to that. And this is key. And we know that when that happens and we get cellular damage, there's certainly an association between even the lengths of our telomeres. So when we look at our genetic makeup, when we look at the chromosomes, we know that there is a direct correlation between the association of telomere length and your serum 25-hydroxy vitamin D level. Once again, they did a study through the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, and this was done through Johns Hopkins University. And they found that higher vitamin D levels led to longer telomere length. And why is this important? Because we're talking about cell longevity. We're talking about how long it is that our cells can survive throughout our life. If our cells continue to die off because of damage, then that basically is shortening our lifespan. So in this study that they did over at Johns Hopkins, that's what they were able to recognize, was that there's this association between lower risk of several chronic disease states as well as all-cause mortality when there was this established relationship between 25-hydroxy vitamin D levels and this anti-inflammatory property that can happen in the body. So this is why when we look at these different links and we say, okay, we have adequate vitamin D that helps protect those end caps of our genetic makeup, that cellular protection, but it is also helping to regulate a proper inflammatory response. And one thing that we know about chronic inflammation is that that does extensive cellular damage. So all of these different things that we certainly now have become more aware of through the years when it comes to vitamin D to make us recognize that vitamin D is not just that bone health vitamin. We know that it is supporting cardiovascular health, and we know that vitamin D deficiency, once again, is common in people with cardiovascular disease. Now, what do we know also about cardiovascular disease is that there is a really strong inflammatory component to that. And when we look and say, okay, so if this person over here has low vitamin D and that can drive up an increase risk of dying from a cardiovascular event, then wouldn't it make sense to make sure that we have adequate vitamin D on board at all times? So these are all things that we have been able to recognize. We see that link with those major markers for inflammation. TNF-alpha is the biggest one that we hone in on when we're looking at vitamin D. And we understand the role that vitamin D is playing to offset those negative effects that can do endothelial damage within our blood vessels, that can create aortic stiffening. All of these things that are measures for cardiovascular risk. So certainly this very important and essential quote unquote hormone, this vitamin, is something that we have to make sure that we are getting an adequate amount of on a daily basis to maintain the health of our cardiovascular system, to maintain the health of our brain, to maintain our immune system and a normal, healthy inflammatory response. But one of the areas that I think is really quite interesting when you look at the research is the role that vitamin D plays in diabetes. And what we know is that people who have diabetes, both of the autoimmune variety, type 1, as well as type 2, have been this direct link with low levels of vitamin D. And vitamin D deficiency makes you 91% more likely to progress to insulin resistance. Let me repeat that. That vitamin D deficiency makes you 91% more likely to progress to insulin resistance. And that is a very alarming number. Now, this was published in the Cardiovascular Diabetes Journal, where they were looking specifically at that direct correlation. I think it's quite critical that when we look at doing a test such as the 25-hydroxy vitamin D, that this isn't somehow a marker for your maintaining bone health. But this is actually a marker for maintaining heart health, maintaining our metabolic health, maintaining our immune health, our brain health. And as I mentioned, so much research now looking at how vitamin D is playing a really important role in maintaining our cognitive function, long-term studies have shown that low levels of vitamin D can increase the risk of cognitive decline by upwards of 60%. We know this now. We have been able to see this in the Journal of Gerontology, showing an increased risk in Alzheimer's when we have low serum vitamin D. And part of that reason is because we know that vitamin D plays a role in terms of nerve cell growth and differentiation. So kind of go back to that term, differentiation, the way cells divide. Remember that link with low vitamin D and cancer developments. So we can also look at this in the setting of brain health and nerve transmission. When you think about the plasticity, the way that the neurons in the brain are communicating with each other. And without adequate vitamin D, because remember, vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin. And we think about the makeup of the brain itself. We're talking anatomical makeup. We have to recognize that those fats are really very important. And if we are not maintaining healthy levels of vitamin D at all time, then we can start to see this wide scoping breakdown of how our body can have a really negative reaction to this. So across the spectrum, understanding that every single system in the body is impacted by vitamin D, and low levels of vitamin D increases our risk for all of those. So when we think about diabetes, when we think about cognitive decline, when we think about heart disease, when we think about certain cancers, we have to be aware that vitamin D is playing a really integral role in those. When we look at what's going on now with severely critically ill COVID-19 patients and seeing that vitamin D deficiency is a common factor. We can't just turn away from that and act as though, well, it's just a random finding. That in Spain, those researchers found that 80% of their over 200 COVID-19 patients in that hospital had a vitamin D deficiency. And with that vitamin D deficiency had an associated increased level of inflammatory markers. So we have to be on top of our A game when it comes to vitamin D. And how much you need to be supplementing with really depends on your serum levels and how well your body actually absorbs that, making sure you're also taking magnesium. Magnesium and vitamin D go hand in hand when it comes to proper uptake into the body. So definitely have your 25-hydroxy vitamin D level tested. Realize vitamin D is well beyond bone health. It is for our overall longevity and for our overall wellness. So that is all that I have for you for today. I just want to thank you so much for tuning in to the Invite Health podcast. Remember, you can find all of our episodes for free wherever you listen to podcasts or by visiting invitehealth.com/podcast. Now do make sure that you subscribe and you leave us a review. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Invite Health. And we will see you next time for another episode of the Invite Health podcast.